I think Indigenous Museum or museology, as we would see it here at the Institute, is a very proactive way for museums and tribal or cultural centers in various indigenous communities to really think seriously about the ways that culture is maintained in an active way, with a culture center or museum as a focal point. And for that matter, a museum itself being a nexus or a place where people of different cultures meet and then are learning about other people. And so from an indigenous viewpoint, what are the ways that worldviews, values, artistic traditions, and the like can be communicated not only to the community itself, because I do believe the museum or the culture center should exist for the community, but also how it can communicate those messages to people of other cultures. And I think it's quite important, particularly in an intensely mediated age where so many of our cultural values are being eroded by what we might call the global community. And there are good things about culture change and being aware of a global community, but it's also important that we maintain a sense of who we are as the various indigenous groups. And I think they are an important way of not only maintaining self-respect and self-awareness, but garnering respect and awareness in a larger global community, particularly now in the era of what we might say cultural tourism, where various communities are focal points for people to visit, that in this global community, when different nations, different tribes, different communities need alliances to confront various social, cultural, environmental, and economic issues. It expands the ability to be able to communicate with many more people. So it's not just a museum or culture center that resides in a museum. I might extend it to the web too. So this museology, a study of how museums done, is expanding beyond the, what would have been originally the natural history model, where which was the outside looking in. In essence, it was like Indians under glass, Indians dissected, but being done so from the values of an external power. And it went from natural history, so Indians as part of the environment, the wildlife, the wild Indians and the vanishing Indians, into Indians as the vanishing race. So the need to save everything before they vanish. And they're still part of the wild, you might say, model. And then moving into the historical model, which is still a sense of outside looking in, because the culture and the history is being told from, you might say, what we talk about here in museum theory is called a meta-narrative, or in art history, which is this grand overreaching story that's been constructed by the West, and how Indians fit into that. So when you look at art history texts, for example, native cultures don't even fit into them until the late 20th century and in the 21st century. And in retrospect, I'd say good, because the art histories and culture histories existed separate and then overlapped and then diverged from this meta-narrative, this big story that tries to explain the existence and, for that matter, sometimes even these aspirations of indigenous communities that aren't coming from the communities themselves. So in this self-awareness and this self-reflectiveness, this museology being ways that tribal communities and other indigenous communities are constructing their own stories from their own perspectives and then presenting them in the ways that they think are the most appropriate. Because there are also different ideas that are supposed to be maintained, you might say, as private or guarded knowledge and belong only to that community. And sometimes that goes counter to what other museum people think and other professionals think, because they think that all knowledge is fair game for everyone. And that's just not the case, that there are certain bits of knowing that you might say, in the same way they have national intelligence and guarding of, you might say, defense, secrets. There are cultural defense and cultural secrets that need to be guarded in exactly the same way you would guard your nation, you guard your culture. And it's not always military. So this museology is the study of, but it's from the inside looking out. So how do indigenous communities take those magnifying glasses or the binoculars or the telescopes or the microscopes and turn them the other way and look at the outside world and describe what they see from their own perspectives and tell the stories in their own ways? I think we need it at IAIA. I think as the premier Center for Contemporary Native American Art, the contemporary Native American art awareness started here and is expanding here in such a way when you look at the various markets around the world, you see that artists who graduated from here are dominating on the global level as well as the national level. Even when you have a student who was at IAIA in the 80s, Gerald McMaster, who's one of the curators at the Venice Biennale. I mean, this is no small stuff. And he was in museum studies, and he's one of the premier curators and voices for indigenous museums, not only in Canada, but in the world. So taking this into a global forum, it's starting here. It's starting at IAIA and other tribal colleges with Native peoples telling their own stories and describing them as distinct and separate histories from the rest of the world with a sense of aspiration, a sense of future, a sense of present, and a sense of past. Something I say quite a bit is that history isn't something that we study of just long ago, that our history is our study of our past to understand our present so that we create our future, which is also a study of history. Where do we want to be? How will we make history? How will we shape history? How will we shape how our communities will be in 100 years? We do this with this, of one of the tools that we can use is museology from indigenous perspective.